All right, so you guys wanted a deep dive into a true crime case, and let me tell you, this one is a doozy. It's been called The Greatest Murder Story Never Told. So buckle up as we take you back to the 1970s when two seemingly ordinary young men, Douglas Gretzler and Willie Steelman, left a trail of 17 victims across Arizona and California.
And what's really captivating about this case is that we're not just going to examine what happened, but delve into the why. What could lead these individuals to such extreme violence? And how did they manage to evade capture for so long? To understand that, we really have to go back to their beginnings.
Yeah, and it's interesting because our sources paint these really different pictures of Gretzler and Steelman's early lives.
Hmm.
Gretzler's family, for example, was well off. His father was actually president of the school district. But there was this underlying tension.
Yeah, there was. The dynamic was complex. Despite the family's affluence, Gretzler's father was incredibly strict. He was constantly pushing, Douglas never seeming satisfied. There's even an anecdote about how he dismissed one of Douglas's good report cards. It left like a lasting impact on him.
Yeah, it almost feels like that constant pressure and lack of approval could push someone to seek validation elsewhere, maybe even in dangerous ways.
Absolutely. And then you add in the tragedy of Gretzler's older brother committing suicide when Douglas was just 15. Instead of offering comfort, his father actually expressed regret that it wasn't Douglas who had died. Imagine the psychological impact of that statement on a young man already struggling with his identity.
That's incredibly disturbing. It's like a recipe for brewing resentment and a need to escape. And it makes you wonder if that early trauma played a role in his later actions.
It's certainly a significant factor to consider. Now, on the other hand, you have Steelman. He came from a completely different background. A social outcast from a poor family, dropped out of school early. His life was marked by instability, failed marriages,
Yeah.
and constant battle with drug addiction.
So, two very different paths, but both seemingly headed towards trouble. And then in 1973, their lives collided in Denver. What's remarkable is that despite their contrasting backgrounds, Gretzler and Steelman formed a quick and intense bond.
It seems they were drawn together by a shared desire for fast money and a mutual disdain for authority. This shared rebellious spirit, combined with their personal struggles, quickly led them down a criminal path, starting with petty theft.
And that's where their story takes a dark turn. They relocate to Arizona, and their crimes begin to escalate. It's like they've fed off each other's recklessness, becoming bolder and more violent. A prime example is the incident in the Orange Grove, where they pistol-whipped and robbed a hitchhiker. It shows a complete disregard for the law and the safety of others.
This escalation is crucial to understanding their descent into violence. It wasn't a sudden shift, it was a gradual process, each crime emboldening them further.
And then there's the case of Catherine Mestites and her boyfriend Robert Robbins. This one is particularly complex because it involves not just murder, but also a twisted love triangle.
Yes, Marcia Renslow, who was traveling with Gretzler and Steelman, had a strange infatuation with Mestites. It adds another layer to an already disturbing situation.
So we have this strange mix of jealousy, paranoia, and escalating violence. Steelman becomes convinced that Mestites and Robbins know too much about their crimes, potentially linking them to two other missing individuals, Kenneth Unrain and Michael Adshade.
And fueled by paranoia and a growing sense of cruelty, Steelman decides they must be eliminated. Gretzler, despite some initial hesitation, ultimately goes along with it.
The murder of Mestites is particularly chilling. Imagine she was shot in the head while performing a seance at her own altar. It speaks volumes about Steelman's cold-blooded nature and the casual disregard for human life that was developing within this duo.
This act marked a point of no return for Gretzler and Steelman. They fled Arizona for California, leaving behind a trail of bodies and a growing sense of terror in their wake. And as we'll see, their brutality only escalated from there.
So last time we left off with Gretzler and Steelman fleeing Arizona after the murder of Catherine Mestites. And their journey back to California is marked by even more disturbing incidents, starting with the abduction of Kenneth Unrain and Michael Adshade.
Yeah. What's striking about these murders is the sheer randomness and brutality. After a seemingly pointless drive, Unrain and Adshade were forced out of the car, bound and stabbed to death. Their lives were simply discarded, highlighting the increasing dehumanization of their victims by Gretzler and Steelman.
It's chilling to think about. You mentioned earlier how their crimes seem to embolden them, and I wonder if this casual cruelty towards Unrain and Adshade contributed to the horror that was about to unfold.
That's a very insightful observation. Their next victims were James Fulkerson and Eileen Halleck, and this case provides a glimpse into the complex and frankly terrifying nature of Steelman's personality. He was on the verge of executing Fulkerson when he suddenly changed his mind after a plea for mercy from the victim.
It's almost as if he enjoyed playing God, holding the power of life and death in his hands. This unpredictable behavior makes him all the more dangerous. One minute he's a cold-blooded killer, the next he's showing a moment of what appears to be compassion.
Exactly. It's crucial to remember that this wasn't true empathy. It was a fleeting whim, a display of power rather than genuine concern. And tragically, this inconsistency would cost more lives just days later in what became known as the Parkin-Erlang massacre.
This event is without a doubt the darkest chapter in their spree. They invaded the Parkin family home, taking hostage the family, two babysitters, and a visitor. What follows is a horrifying ordeal of terror and violence.
For you, the listener, to fully grasp the extent of their cruelty, we need to break down what happened. Over several hours, Steelman, the dominant force in this horrific play, manipulated the situation with an unsettling calmness. He forced Walter Parkin to drive him to the family's supermarket to rob the safe, while the other hostages remained bound and terrified in the home.
The level of control and premeditation is staggering. It wasn't just about the robbery, it was about exerting power over their victims.
Precisely. And then after meticulously wiping down the house for fingerprints, they systematically executed all 9 hostages, including 2 young children in a walk-in closet. The methodical nature of these murders is truly chilling.
It's hard to fathom the level of depravity that would lead someone to commit such acts. But as horrific as the Parkin-Erlang massacre was, it would ultimately be their undoing. Their capture, much like their crimes, is a story filled with dramatic twists and turns.
You see, despite the nationwide manhunt, Steelman continued to use stolen credit cards and identification from his victims, including a young couple they murdered in Tucson just days before the Sandbergs.
So even after committing their most horrific crime, they continued with this casual disregard for the law. It's mind-boggling.
It speaks to their arrogance and complete disconnect from reality. They ended up in Sacramento, still driving the Sandbergs' car, and incredibly, Steelman bought a newspaper. There he was, staring at his own mugshot on the front page, realizing the walls were closing in.
That must have been a terrifying realization to see your face plastered across the news as one of the most wanted men in America.
Panic set in, and they made a desperate attempt to flee California. They tried to convince a female acquaintance to drive them to Florida, but she wisely refused. Low on cash, with their faces everywhere, they were running out of options.
So how did this desperate escape attempt finally come to an end? What led to their capture?
Well, their downfall was a combination of bad decisions and sheer luck. Steelman sent Gretzler back to their hotel to grab their belongings while he waited at the woman's apartment. However, a hotel clerk recognized Gretzler and alerted the police.
That's incredible. One small act of attentiveness from a hotel clerk brought an end to their reign of terror.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, seemingly small actions can have a profound impact. Now, while Gretzler sensed something was wrong and managed to briefly evade the police, he eventually surrendered, even hiding a gun in a small space above a doorway before doing so.
What about Steelman? Did he try to escape?
His capture was even more dramatic. It involved a standoff with police, a live radio broadcast to assure his safety, and ultimately his surrender, with his hands up, shouting to reporters that he guessed he was going back to Stockton. It was a spectacle, almost a performance for an audience he had cultivated through his crimes.
It's fascinating how even in his final moments before capture, Steelman seemed to crave attention, playing the role of the notorious criminal.
Exactly. It reveals a lot about his personality and his need for control. But with their capture, the focus shifted to obtaining confessions and unraveling the full extent of their crimes. This is where we see the first cracks in their partnership begin to show.
So they're finally in custody. What happens next? Do they confess to their crimes?
Well, their reactions to interrogation were quite different. While Steelman initially remained silent, Gretzler was more cooperative, gradually revealing details about their crimes. He claimed he was merely a follower manipulated by the supposedly charismatic and domineering Steelman. But it was clear he was deeply involved in every step of their spree.
It sounds like he was trying to shift the blame to paint himself as a victim of Steelman's influence. Did that strategy work?
Not entirely. While Gretzler attempted to minimize his role, investigators saw through this facade. And what about Steelman? Did he ever admit to his role in the murders?
That's a great question. Did Steelman ever crack under pressure and confess?
He did eventually confess. But his version of events, much like his persona, was a carefully constructed narrative. He minimized his involvement, portrayed himself as a victim of circumstance, and even tried to pin some of the murders on a drug dealer friend named Preacher. Of course, investigators didn't buy this attempt to deflect blame.
So we have Gretzler claiming to be a follower and Steelman spinning elaborate tales to minimize his role. It seems their once strong bond forged in rebellion and crime was beginning to crumble under the weight of their actions.
It's a crucial turning point in their story. With confessions in hand and a mountain of evidence against them, the trials began, first in California and then in Arizona. But their legal strategies, much like their personalities, would diverge, leading to very different outcomes.
Okay, so we're back and ready to unpack the final chapter of this Gretzler and Steelman saga. Their capture, marked the end of their reign of terror. But their story, as we've seen, is far from over. Last time we were talking about their confessions and the upcoming trials in California and Arizona, so what happened next?
Well, their legal proceedings and their lives in prison actually took these fascinatingly different turns. Gretzler, hoping for some leniency in California, pleaded guilty to the 9 murders in Victor and accepted a sentence of life imprisonment. Steelman, however, decided on a different route, pleading no contest in exchange for the prosecution dropping a kidnapping charge.
Okay, so different approaches, but ultimately the same result in California life behind bars. But they still had to face those charges in Arizona for the murders of the Sandbergs and Gilbert Sierra.
You got it. And this is where their paths really diverge. In Arizona, Gretzler, still kind of hoping for a lighter sentence, tried to play it as if he was just a follower, manipulated by the seemingly charismatic and domineering Steelman.
So he was still trying to pass the buck, but did it work this time?
Well, no, unfortunately for Gretzler, the jury wasn't buying it. They saw through his attempts to minimize his role in the crimes and ultimately found him guilty and sentenced him to death. Steelman, always the showman, decided to go for a bolder, more dramatic approach, an insanity plea. His defense argued that he was schizophrenic and couldn't control his actions.
That's a risky move considering how calculated and methodical their crimes were. Did they manage to convince the jury?
You know, he was a close one. The defense presented a compelling case, highlighting Steelman's sometimes erratic behavior, his history of drug use, and the possibility of brain damage. The jury actually deliberated for over 11 hours, which shows you how much they considered those arguments. But in the end, they found him guilty, and just like Gretzler, sentenced him to death.
Wow, so both Gretzler and Steelman find themselves on death row in Arizona. It's hard to even imagine what that must have been like, facing that ultimate punishment for their horrible crimes. Did their behavior in prison reflect their earlier actions at all?
That's where we see this truly remarkable split in their personalities. Steelman remained the defiant, manipulative guy we've come to know. He was constantly causing trouble for the guards, instigating conflicts, and landing himself in solitary over and over again. He'd even spin these elaborate tales for anyone who'd listen, claiming he was innocent, inventing heroic backstories, even saying he was a changed man studying to become a minister.
It's like even in prison, he couldn't resist manipulating things, trying to control the narrative and get attention. It seems like he just thrived on that chaos.
You hit the nail on the head. It's a fascinating look into his psyche. And what's even more intriguing is that even with how crazy his claims were, he still managed to fool some people. Some folks even sent him money and gifts, believing these carefully constructed lies.
That shows you just how good he was at manipulation, even locked up in prison. But you mentioned the split in their personalities. How did Gretzler handle life on death row?
Gretzler's transformation in prison was something else, maybe even more so than Steelman's constant manipulation. He cut off all contact with Steelman, like he finally realized how toxic that influence had been. Instead, he tried to find forgiveness from his family, and he even wrote apology letters to the families of his victims.
That's hard to wrap your head around. A remorseful Gretzler seeking forgiveness after committing those awful acts. What do you think caused this shift in him?
It's impossible to know for sure. But maybe the reality of his situation, the isolation of death row and facing his own mortality, forced him to truly face what he had done. It's also possible that without Steelman around, he could finally reflect on his past without that manipulative voice in his ear.
Makes you think maybe without Steelman, Gretzler might have gone down a different road. But in the end, they were both facing the same fate. Did they both end up being executed?
It's kind of ironic, but Steelman never actually faced the executioner. He died from cirrhosis of the liver in 1986, basically drinking himself to death on death row. A fitting end, I guess, for a man who lived a life of chaos and excess.
It's like his own self-destructive behavior finally caught up to him. What about Gretzler? Did he exhaust all of his appeals?
He did. He exhausted all his appeals and even refused to fight his execution date. In 1998, he was executed by lethal injection. He'd become the longest-serving death row inmate in Arizona history at that point. His last words were a simple but powerful apology. "From the bottom of my soul, I'm so deeply sorry and have been for years for murdering Patricia and Michael Sandberg. Though I am being executed for that crime, I apologize to all 17 victims and their families.
Wow. His words are haunting. They really make you think about the human cost of these crimes. It's so hard to grasp that someone capable of such awful things could also express such genuine remorse.
Yeah, the Gretzler-Steelman case is really a chilling example of the darkness that can live inside people who seem totally ordinary. Their story forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths about evil, the complexity of the human mind, and that even in the face of such terrible acts, there's still a possibility, however small, of redemption.
This deep dive has been a heavy one, a journey through a dark part of American crime. We've explored the lives of these two men whose paths crossed in a wave of violence and terror, leaving behind so many victims and shattered lives. Their story reminds us how fragile life is and the lasting impact our choices have, good or bad.
If you're interested in learning more about this really complex case, I recommend checking out the documentary, The Greatest Murder Story Never Told. It offers an even deeper and more thought-provoking look at things, including interviews with Gretzler himself.
That's it for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.